Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's virtual program with Turnstile Tours. I'm Andrew Gustafson,
And I'm Cindy Vandenbosch.
and we're so glad that you could join us today. See a lot of familiar names here on the webinar. Couple things, housekeeping that we'll go through before we dive into today's program about public markets. This program, unfortunately, we had to postpone it last month in December due to some personal issues. But we're really happy to be able to bring this to you now in 2022. And if you have any questions, please drop them into the chat. We're going to be talking about a lot of different places around the country, different public markets and public market systems. We'll talk about New York as well, but other places. And we encourage you to share if you've been to any of these places. And really, we're going to be tackling this question that's in the title of the program, which is, what is a public market? And so we're going to think about that in a lot of different contexts because there's not one single definition. So we encourage you to join the conversation, and you can do that through the chat. We also, as always, have closed captioning, so you can turn that on or off at the bottom of your screen. And it's just going to be the two of us online today, so we'll do our best to handle your questions in the chat. Yeah, so let's kind of dive into this question of what is a public market. And I should add that we spent all day Saturday
Yes.
in a public market at the Essex Market. So
during the blizzard.
Yes.
So it was open. Many of the vendors were there and we were able to pull it off. And it was our very first student tour. So a tour for high school students. They were visiting from New Mexico, and it was really exciting. Like first time in 2 years, I think. Yeah.
Obviously,
we pulled it off.
We've been to the Essex Market a lot over the last 2 years to do our shopping, but this was the first time we did a tour. A little bit of background and why we're discussing this topic today. So we've been working with the New York City public market system since 2011. Is that right, Cindy?
Yeah, I think that's about right.
And why don't you tell us a little bit about how you kind of encountered the market? I mean, you've obviously working on the Lower East Side for so many years, you knew about the Essex Market, but you sort of encountered this other market, the Moore Street Market.
Right. So Essex Market, being at the time in museum, I used to eat lunch there all the time. So I really knew the vendor, got to know some of the vendors pretty well and loved it. And then we were developing some tours starting to think about developing tours in Williamsburg. And while a lot of the architecture spoke to the German immigrant history of the neighborhood, the fact of the matter is that when you talk to people in the community in the eastern part of Williamsburg, when you ask them about history and you ask them about important places, so many people talk about the Moore Street Market, which is the public market of East Williamsburg. And so we at the time had just launched our food cart tours as well, and had been thinking a lot about street vending. And of course, as we'll talk about today, there's that connection between street vending and public markets. The eastern part of Williamsburg today is largely Latino, also African-American. It's a diverse community that's there. And the La Marqueta de Williamsburg has often been it's been a staple for generations, especially for people from Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and other populations. And now there's other vendors there like Turco's Grill, which is making Mediterranean food. But it is really like a community gathering space. And so we did oral histories in English and Spanish with all the vendors, as well as people in the surrounding community, because by having the market there, it was an outgrowth and a connection to all the bustling commercial activity on Graham Avenue and Moore Street in the surrounding area. So we see that with all of the public markets, I think, in New York City.
Yeah, and we've done a couple virtual programs about the Moore Street Market, so we'll be sure to share those, as well as the ones we've done about Essex Market. But yeah, that's kind of where our journey with the public market system began. And then we were, after doing tours for years at the Essex Market, or at the Moore Street Market and around Graham Avenue, we were invited to do tours of Essex Market starting in 2015, and we've navigated the transition from the old market to the new market building. And, obviously, it's a tour that we haven't been able to do since the pandemic started, in part because a lot of people are shopping there, but they're limiting where you can eat food, and it makes it a little hard to do a food tour when you can't taste food on the floor. But we had the opportunity this past weekend to do this tour that we booked back in like August, which felt like a different world, like, oh, things are going to get back to normal soon. And so then we had to adapt and figure out a way to kind of like cater the food and talk to the vendors separately from eating the food. But it all worked out. And it was a little bit of a blessing that it was snowing, because the group had nothing else to do. Everything else was canceled, but the market stayed open, which is something we'll talk about, the important role that public markets play in times of crisis. And there weren't that many people in the market either, so we kind of had the
Right.
place to ourselves. So
Got to chat with everybody. It was really
yeah,
nice.
so it's actually nice to do this program now after we had the opportunity
Yeah.
to give to be in a public market and work with the vendors for the first time in a really long time. But that's just one example that we're going to talk about. But let's start sort of with the basics and talk about this question. And the thing about public markets is I think that we don't really think of them as an American thing, right? We'll talk about the history, how they very much are, but I feel like public markets are something that you go and visit when you travel, and travel abroad. Unless you live next to, a well-known public market, that may be the context in which you think of them mostly. So we think about like Leal and Paris, these grand, public buildings with all sorts of different artisanal vendors inside of them, that sort of have this like ancient lineage. I think that's sort of one typology of public markets that people think of when they hear the term. And the other is maybe something like this, the Mercado de Sonora in Mexico City, these sort of massive, raucous, a little bit chaotic markets in the developing world. We've been to markets like this, obviously in Mexico, but in, Cambodia, we went to some that were really incredible.
And Hong Kong too.
And Hong Kong, yep,
Yeah.
yep. So we think about it in that context. Again, it's sort of a foreign concept in many ways, but we want to kind of expand the definition, and really put it more in that American context, because it's something that has a long history in this country and exists in many cities, although we may not recognize them as public markets per se. I just had to show some pictures of Sonora, which was amazing. I got to go to Mexico. This was back in 2013. And one of the vendors that we worked with at the Moore Street Market, Las Jimelas, which imports a lot of like medicinal herbs from Mexico. I was like, where should I go in Mexico City? And they said, you have to go to this market, which is where they get a lot of their supplies. And so this amazing stand selling mole. It's also where I learned to make my favorite taco recipe, which is tacos with nopales, which are cactus, guacamole, and French fries.
Which we've made for our nieces and nephews
Yeah,
many times during the summer, and they love it.
Yeah. So we're going to talk a lot about food on the program today, but I just wanted to share one of my favorite public markets outside of the United States.
And along those lines, please jump into the chat.
Yeah.
And as we go along, share some of your favorite markets that you've been to. If you've been to them abroad and you really enjoyed them, we'd love to hear about them.
Yeah.
And we're going to dig in on markets across the United States now.
Yeah. But, we should think more about markets rather than these sort of singular public buildings. And, the thinking is now thinking about a market system or a market city. So, for example, Barcelona has this plan where everyone in the city will be within 10 minutes walk of some form of public market.
This is amazing.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And so here you can see this heat map of the public markets around the city. So think of it as a system or a network, rather than one sort of large public edifice, which is how we often think of them.
And is this how many cities approach it?
They're starting to, and
Yeah.
we'll talk about some examples of that. I think New York City is an example of a city that does it, but we'll talk about some other places as well. But let's look at the definitions, and there's no singular definition. And I think this is an area of debate, and we're going to have that debate on the program today. But I wanted to pull together a few different definitions, some of which I don't totally agree with. I think there are things missing, or I think they're overly narrow. But this is the Boston Public Market, which is a relatively new institution. It's not the Boston Public Market you may be thinking of, which we'll talk about. But they break it down into four basic characteristics. One is that a public market primarily sells food. I think that's generally true, but we'll talk about ways in which other sorts of merchandise vendors can fit into the public market system. The second one I don't necessarily agree with. It says a public market is open year round. So I think they're defining it again as more of a sort of permanent institution in one physical place. So it distinguishes public markets from farmers markets, which I don't necessarily agree with, but this is how they choose to define it. Number three, a public market is made up of small independent businesses, and each shop or stall is owned or operated. I think that's generally a pretty good definition. And then four, a public market fulfills a public purpose beyond retail food sales. And this is one of the most important ones. So here they mention that it provides customers with an experience. It's a bustling and vibrant place that brings people together to taste new flavors, learn, watch the process of food being made. That's something we talk about a lot, is how it fits into the food system. And it is a civic resource for everyone. So this part I really like.
Yeah, and this talks about also like classes and
Mhm.
workshops for the public. And I know, the new Essex Market's been so exciting with the teaching kitchen and being able, especially before COVID, to bring in people from the surrounding community to do free cooking classes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we kind of pulled some things from that and some other literature on this. A lot of this presentation, we've learned so much from the Project for Public Spaces, which has a Market Cities initiative, which they've been doing now for about 12 years. And they've done some really, really amazing studies and supporting cities kind of navigate building out their public market system. But I think there are a few things that we need to add to this definition. So one is that it operates in a public space. This is one of the most complicated things because there are lots of privately owned spaces that are publicly accessible. And then there's lots of publicly owned spaces that are not open to the public, right? So it doesn't just come down to, is this on government land or not? But it has to be a truly public convening place. And also, I think a place where there's some accountability to the public as well is really important. It has to feature local vendors and producers, which was in the definition. It has public goals and purpose. So it cannot just be, for the purpose of making money, but there needs to be some larger purpose, whether it's public health or supporting, entrepreneurs and economic development, or providing a safe space for people to convene and vend. And then, we expanded the definition a little bit and said that it can include indoor, outdoor, permanent, seasonal, and temporary market spaces. Those can all be part of a cohesive and effective public market system. So this comes from the Project for Public Spaces. And I really like this, rather than just looking at the form, what are the actual benefits and activities of the public markets? And we're going to look at all 6 of these throughout the program today. And I think as we look back, to the 17th century and we look to the present day, I think these 6 things actually hold up pretty well as we look throughout the history. So one is brings together diverse people. That's something really important and something that some markets don't do so well that we're going to talk about. 2, it renews downtowns and neighborhoods. So a place that really can help to reactivate public places, especially if you're talking about a new market initiative. It links urban and rural economies. So that farmers market element is really important. Provides economic opportunity. So we'll talk about that. Promotes public health. And it can do this in a lot of different ways. Cooking classes is one, but we're also going to talk about basic sanitation as well.
Yeah.
Has been an important part of market's history. And then creates active public space. So keep these 6 things in mind, and we'll allude back to them as we walk through some different examples. But I wanted to start with some examples of things that we think are not public markets, right? And so throw them into the chat. Maybe you have some ideas like, is this a public market? And we can discuss it. But let's start with one. I mentioned, if you think of Boston's public market, you might think of Faneuil Hall, right? Mm-hmm. And so we recently visited Faneuil Hall, or right before the pandemic. We went there for my sister's birthday. And would you call this a public market?
I mean, on one hand, it's supporting local businesses,
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
And it seems like it's a public space.
It's certainly active, right?
It's an active space. It's bringing a lot of people together. Whether there is like a very diverse, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that it meets all the criteria.
Yes. I mean, from my experience, I would say that one of the areas where a potential public market falls down is that it doesn't have a good mix of local shoppers and visitors or
Yeah,
tourists.
there were many more tourists there, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think that's another important part of the definition is that it has to actually serve the local community. And it can't just do that by attracting tourists, right? So it has to be a place that if you want to, you could do your, regular grocery shopping there. So there has to be a mix of kind of, you know, gourmet or prepared foods or specialty foods, but also basic staples, I think.
Right. Like if you're going to shop, you aren't always going to like buy the fudge in the case. Like you actually need to buy fruits and vegetables
Right. You
and
you 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 you
staples.
can't eat legal seafood chowder every single day, right? That doesn't count.
It's like going beyond the food hall
Right,
concept.
exactly. So this is not to knock Faneuil Hall. It's been a
No, it's
tremendously
great.
successful, reactivation of a historic building. But I wouldn't call it a public market. Maybe people disagree. Similarly, Grand Central Market.
We thought for sure this was Grand Central in New York.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yes.
Um,
So again, like I think there's a lot of prepared foods, but you could buy cheese from Murray's Cheese. That's
Oh,
local.
sure. And you can get your bread from Zabar's and
Yes.
stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I think this does kind of meet the definition that some people do some of their basic daily shopping there. But in other ways, does it fulfill the need? Does it serve a public health need? I wouldn't necessarily say that it does. Um, you know, the oh, we have someone in the chat.
Yeah, we
Sorry.
have someone weighing in here. These are
Uh,
not public markets.
So Matthew says that they charge admission, they have a minimum purchase rules, they have time limits, they act as a tool of gentrification, primarily geared to tourists or non-local residents, provide an unwelcoming experience to the existing community with too much security, selling products that local community can't afford or aren't their taste. Matthew, you hit so many things right on the head with some of these spaces. I think that even spaces that are ostensibly public, like for example, Grand Central Terminal is a public space, but yeah, a lot of these spaces are policed, and they're not a convening space for you if you are not actively buying something, right? So it doesn't
Right.
fulfill those other kind of civic definitions. So I really like the way that you put that. So thank you for sharing. So again, some of these things on the surface, if you hadn't really thought about it, you might think, oh, that's a public market, but it really doesn't meet some of these less obvious criteria than just selling food and having local vendors, right?
And I would say the criticism that Matthew raises about markets being used as a tool for gentrification is totally valid, and it's a debate that's happening.
And this is a good example of it, actually. So the Grand Central Market, we took this picture and visited the Grand Central Market about 9 years ago. And this is a market that dates all the way back to 1917. It's in downtown LA. And within pretty recent memory, downtown LA was not the most desirable place to live, but there's been a huge amount of development and gentrification of that area. And the Grand Central Market, which had long been anchored by a lot of immigrant vendors that were serving immigrant communities, many of those people have been displaced, especially since major redevelopment was done in 2014 with more gourmet specialty and prepared food purveyors. So again, we haven't been there since the renovation was done, but from what we've read is that a good proportion of these immigrant vendors have been pushed out, and it's less a place where those communities, can find that culturally appropriate food and those specialty ingredients that they need for their cuisine. It's also the fact that most people, you wouldn't know this when you walked in, but Grand Central Market is privately owned. It's a privately owned space. I mean, I think the person that bought it, they bought it back in the 1980s when it was in really rough shape. I think they did it for altruistic purposes, but it's still run by by a developer, and has, to many people's eye, been an engine of gentrification in Los Angeles. Luckily, Los Angeles has lots of other truly public markets, but this one is the most famous, and obviously the most popular, and very popular with tourists as well. But so this is one that again, I think it may pass the eye test, but when you dig a little bit deeper, it's harder to define as a public market. I also we're going to talk in the program today about wholesale markets as well, and do these qualify as public markets. So for example, the New Fulton Fish Market, it is open to the public. If you want to go, you just got to pay $10.
You should go. I mean, you do have to go in the middle of the night,
and
but it's very interesting.
And most of the vendors require you to buy at least, I think, 10 pounds of fish. So if you really need a lot of fish, it's a good place to go.
Take orders from your neighbors and then go.
But it doesn't really have a retail section. It doesn't really serve the community. People in Hunts Point, aren't going there to buy their fish to cook at home, right? But many of the markets that we'll talk about sort of straddle this line between wholesale and retail, and we're seeing an increasing number of wholesale locations that are adding a retail component as a way to attract new business. So we'll talk about some examples of that as well. So definitely an important piece of public infrastructure, but I wouldn't say it meets these definitions of a public market. Now in New York City, we have our public market system, which we've talked about at great length, and we'll walk through the history a bit more. But this is what the system looks like today, in the sense that these are the markets that are operated by the city's, what is sort of the successor to the Department of Markets, which is underneath the New York City Economic Development Corporation. So we have 4 historic public markets: Arthur Avenue, Essex, La Marqueta in East Harlem, and the Moore Street Market. But then we also have the city-operated Jamaica Farmers Market, and then Gourmet Glatt, which is kind of interesting. That's it's the former 13th Avenue Retail Market, which is in Borough Park. Now it has a single supermarket operator, so it's a kosher grocery store, but it's still a publicly owned building. But I would say, again, it's not really a public convening place.
Right. And what we're not seeing here, right, is like the Grow NYC farmers markets, which are serving these purposes. So I think this is the classification that falls under the connection to the old Department of Markets and who's administering these properties now.
Right.
But there's such a, you could even argue that like a Queens Night Market that's making street food accessible, is that a public, is that providing?
Yeah, I don't know, but we'll look at some examples. So, I mean, Essex Market, again, we would say it qualifies as a public market, although it's on public land, but it's in a private building, it's in a private development, but it is a public place. It is a place of convening. It does serve a public health purpose and supporting food entrepreneurs. So even though it's no longer in its old, city-owned, city-built edifice on the other side of Delancey, it's now in the Essex Crossing development. I think it still meets all those criteria. But in some cases, even those public edifices don't meet the criteria. So this, for example, is the Strip District Terminal in Pittsburgh. So this was the former large wholesale market on the Strip. As you know, Cindy and I have spent a lot of time in Pittsburgh over the last couple of years working on a project there. But this is, it's kind of disappointing. You have these beautiful public buildings that were built for wholesale and retail food distribution, but they were redeveloped by a private developer, and they're not a public market. They're kind of like a mall, and they're not very well. The occupancy is pretty low. Obviously, the pandemic might have something to do with that, but they're definitely not a public market. However, Pittsburgh does have a pretty vibrant public market system in the form of dozens of farmers markets stretched across the city and Allegheny County. And part of the development of that was supported by the Project for Public Spaces. So Pittsburgh is one of their model market cities. So even though you look at their, that public market building in the central city, it doesn't really fulfill that purpose, but there are other institutions that do. Um, this is a neat example, which I think qualifies as a public market. A lot of people don't know about it, but Cindy, yeah, can you tell us a little bit about the Flatbush Caton market?
Yeah, has anybody who's here been to the Flatbush Caton Market? They've this was a market that was established going back, I guess, to the year 2000, and it was supported by the first Caribbean female councilwoman. And it was not established by her, but really with her support
Mhm.
to provide a space for a lot of the street vendors that were selling along Flatbush Avenue and in a neighborhood that's largely Caribbean. And so, there's this open air kind of marketplace that operated for many years. And now there's
And they had an enclosed
yeah, there
building,
was yes,
which was on Flatbush and Caton, and that was owned by the city, right?
right.
But that lot, the city decided to bring in a developer to build affordable housing on that lot. But part of that project, like Essex Market, was to put Flatbush Caton on the first floor of that new building.
Right, that's right. So they're going to have about 30 vendors,
Mhm.
from what I understand, many of which are the existing vendors. And so these are people that are selling anything from, there's one of a kind handmade dolls that one of the vendors sells. There's fashion, jewelry, there's personal care products, and there'll be a few food vendors. But it's really sort of a mixture.
Yeah.
And it's a market that really is meant to be in and of the community that surrounds it. And so I think, like, in many ways, that's what makes a really thoughtful, well curated market, that it's responding to the needs of the community.
Mhm.
And it's supporting local entrepreneurs that are local, that are from that community themselves. And there's, in terms of the affordable housing, my understanding, it's going to be over 200 units of affordable housing.
It's 100% affordable. The building.
Yeah. And they, if you're watching their Instagram, they've been packing up their boxes over the last week. So
Yeah,
hopefully they'll be opening soon.
So they moved out of their old building on the corner of Flatbush and Caton, and for the last several years they've been in this building, which is an old furniture store, on Clarendon and Flatbush, so a few blocks south. And so the market has continued to operate, and they'll be moving back in momentarily. So
Yeah.
we're really excited.
Any minute now.
Yeah, our friend Lisa Thompson has been running the market, and we knew her from the Moore Street Market and the Essex Market. So yeah, so again, this is primarily merchandise, but really something that's in and of the community. All of the vendors are Caribbean. We have people from Trinidad, Panama, Jamaica, all over.
And it's really, I mean, I think too, you want your public market, if it's in and of a neighborhood, to also be a center for events, a gathering place, a gathering space. And certainly historically it was that. And now, as they move back to this new space, I know that's a big priority for them.
Yeah. Again, we talked about how important farmers markets are, and I think the Grow NYC, and in this case, the farmers market we go to most frequently is the one at Grand Army Plaza in Brooklyn. We'll also talk about the important role that public markets play in, providing resilience for the city and for the food system. And the farmers markets have definitely been critically important for people in getting, fresh, affordable food, and in this unique circumstance of the pandemic in which people did not want to go inside. So they're happy to go to a farmer's market in the dead of winter to do their shopping. So it again filled a really critical niche in many different ways. But I would also argue that informal spaces of outdoor vending are also public markets, like Corona Plaza. I think this checks pretty much all of the boxes. You could argue that it doesn't necessarily fulfill a public health purpose, but certainly public health authorities in New York City recognize what an important convening place this is, and it's a good place to get out public health information and services. So I think, and if you're not familiar with Corona Plaza in Queens, it's where there are about 90 different street vendors, almost all of them unlicensed. There are a handful of licensed food carts that are there. Most of them are unlicensed vendors, from and basically all of them Spanish speaking, from various countries. And it's just this incredibly, it certainly fits the definition when you talk about activated and vibrant public
Oh
spaces.
yeah.
It's this DOT plaza that otherwise would just be sort of a concrete slab with one of those robot bathrooms in the middle of it. But the vendors have really transformed it into this public space, and it's also a place of safety for them, right? They have this safety in numbers, where they can feel that they can protect and help one another. Um, but it's also a magnet for people that want to try all the incredible food that's available there. So
And again, it's activated too. Like people have outdoor church there, and they
mhm.
do outdoor cultural gatherings. And it's just, if you haven't had the chance to go, it's such an amazing sort of part of the city, and I think of the world.
Yeah,
Like,
and it's not totally informal either. There are sort of the vendors themselves have organized, and they're definitely sort of understanding with the local authorities and with the business improvement district and Department of Transportation that like let the market kind of continue to operate. So it's definitely an informal economy, but it's also organized, right, in its own way.
and in a way, come on, like how is this so different than if you go back 100 years ago, and there were
Exactly.
Jewish vendors that were setting up on the Lower East Side, or
Sure.
different communities, or even from the outdoor
Mhm.
Caribbean markets of
Yep.
like 30 years ago in Flatbush.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So there have been, it's hard, it's something that's hard to define, right? What is a public market? But let's take a look back in history and see kind of how we got to where we are and what have been the different evolutions of public markets. And so we'll start with an example we know well, which is New York City. So uh, you could argue that the public market is the oldest public infrastructure, maybe in the world, but certainly in the case of New York City. We really had public markets before we had, public water infrastructure or any real utilities. Um, at first, the markets were actually set up not by the authorities, but by neighborhood associations. They had subscriptions, and they had the vendors actually pay to get the markets built, and then they paid rent in them. And one of the first ones was this one, which was the Fly Market, which is on today what's Maiden Lane. And markets have been regulated in New York City since the 1670s. And part of the reason why, you could sort of point to two main reasons why markets were actually quite heavily regulated in the 17th, 18th, and really through the first half of the 19th century. One was that there was a genuine fear that cities would run out of food, right? Cities could not grow their own food, and there were not sophisticated transportation networks. And so it was felt that you needed infrastructure and you needed the public authorities to have systems in place that could provision the city, right? And so having a well-organized system of markets could ensure that, producers coming from the hinterlands would have a place to sell their produce, and they could also, monitor prices and things like that to make sure that the city was getting fed. Number two was public health, specifically with meat. Actually, up until 1843, you could not sell raw meat in New York City outside of a public market. It was very, very heavily regulated. As you can see here, this is a butcher stand, probably in a public market, that was done by an artist named Nicolino Callio. We did a whole program on him and his artwork of market and street vendors. But this system birthed the first true public markets, in that they were funded and built by the city. The first one being the Washington Market, which was on the west side of Manhattan, that was completed in 1813, and grew to be this huge, sprawling wholesale and retail market that operated up until the 1960s. And then the second in 1824, 1822 was the Fulton Market. And so that persisted in 2000 up until 2005, but only with the fish market surviving.
right.
And so here you can see this image from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, and all the people. This is specifically about watermelon. But again, inside you have all these, small, definitely local, definitely independent vendors inside these sprawling market stalls. Yeah.
So would you say like in the early 19th century or even predating that, you have like vendors associations almost that are
Yeah.
setting up the marketplaces?
Yeah, for sure. So they would be managed by vendors. Usually, I believe that the person that would oversee the market, usually they were paid as like a proportion of sales.
Oh,
Um, yeah. So they were definitely, today we might call them sort of public-private partnerships, but the buildings themselves at this point in time, from the 1820s to the 1840s, are being actually built by the city, and the city is thinking about a public market system. That starts to be dismantled in the 1840s, and we don't have real kind of progress made for another few decades, where the city starts to build public markets again, and they start to be built in other cities as well. Now, again, we've had public markets as long as there have been towns where every single person doesn't grow their own food, right?
right.
Wherever producers are coming to where the population is, you could say that's a public market. And in many cases, the sort of formalized indoor public market emerged where those informal outdoor gathering places were located, right? And so that's the case with Fulton and Washington for sure. Skip ahead. So, starting in the 1880s, 1890s, a lot of cities, New York included, start to build these larger wholesale markets as well, driven in part by changes in technology and especially transportation. So we see the form of the public market change, driven not so much by what people are eating, but where it's coming from and how it's getting there. So a lot of public markets are built around railroads, and they're built later on in the 20th century around trucking. Right. And so that's what you see here with the Wallabout Market, which was built in the 1880s and persisted up until 1941, when it was torn down to accommodate the expansion of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which you can see in the distance.
And another key technology that would feed into all of this, really starting towards the late 19th century, would have been the refrigerated rail cars.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Exactly. So food can travel farther. Perishable food can travel farther with refrigeration. Yeah, and so that also drives the development of many different public markets. And you see, the public health aspect of it as well. You see another little boom in public market construction in the 30s and 40s, driven by the New Deal. So here we can see this WPA poster telling you what a market is. But you can see again the connection to trucking and shipping and the public market as a transportation hub. On the wholesale side, but many of these wholesale markets also had retail components. And then, food education becomes important. And here we can see New York City's most famous food educator, Francis Foley Gannon, who worked for the New York City Department of Markets, educating people not just about healthy food, but also about food prices. A big push to build public markets was also, it came during these economic shocks, right? We had a depression in 1893. We have the shock of World War I. We have the Great Depression. And during those times, there were genuine fears that food wasn't getting into cities because of the inefficiency of the distribution system and also because of price shock. So having this sort of public option where they could, use this public infrastructure for distribution and get food out to people at fair prices. It was part of an effort to combat speculation and price gouging as well. So that was what Frances Foley Gannon talked about a lot on WNYC.
Yeah, she had a 5-minute segment you hear every morning on WNYC. And I think like thinking about Frances Foley Gannon on the radio, as well as this advertisement, I kind of wish we had a little bit more of this today. I think there are different ways that the message of reaching people and kind of explaining where their food comes from and how we think about that and how we value sort of public market spaces. We could do a better job of that,
Yeah. And I think part of it is that, so much of our food distribution is basically outsourced to private industry, right? Like the big grocery chains have their own logistics network.
Right.
And I think when we talk about food education, it's frankly like very patrician, right? We think about food education as people who like don't know how to like make or cook healthy food for themselves, right? There's definitely sort of a class aspect to the way we treat food education.
Which is not the truth. That's not the
No,
case,
it's not the
right?
truth, but I'm saying that's the attitude, right? In a
Yeah.
lot of cases. So food education doesn't necessarily reach the broader public when it should, right? Yeah, and then of course, Mayor LaGuardia really transformed New York's public market system and built the basis of the market system that we have today, thinking not just about wholesale distribution, but also thinking about moving street vendors off of the street, in part because of the rise of trucks and automobiles on the street. So moving street vendors into indoor public markets and shutting down these informal outdoor pushcart markets.
And this would be one of the markets that no longer serves that original intended purpose.
Yeah, this is now the Theater for the New City is inside the First Avenue Market. But here you can see some of the vendors. And it was also, again, a public health motivation about making the markets more sanitary, by putting them inside, making all of the vendors wear white coats, for example. It's much easier to have an inspection regime when you have the, all of the vendors within 10 pre-specified market buildings as opposed to on the street all over the city. So.
Right. There was a real focus on the weights and measures and on regulation around each of the markets.
Yeah, it's not just public health, it's also consumer protection, right? So, yeah, and so again, this is the public market system in New York as it was conceived of by LaGuardia, built largely between 36 and 42, and then the Harlem market is long delayed and not built until 1955. But you can see the ones in bold are the ones that are still operating in their current building. Essex Market is in italics because it's in a different building. And then the Havemeyer Market, that building is still there, as is the 13th Avenue Market and the First Avenue Market, but they're no longer public markets, but the buildings are still standing.
But the Havemeyer, isn't it? It is a supermarket.
It's a C-town.
C-town,
yeah,
and there's the 13th Avenue Market.
Yeah, in Williamsburg.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then of course, as we get into the post-war period, again, as the automobile continues to grow in its use on city streets, there's a desire to move some of these more high intensity wholesale activities out of the city center. So this is what the Washington Market looked like in 46, basically in the footprint of what is today the World Trade Center. And so they didn't want all of these trucks clogging the streets that were ripe for large scale development. And so much of this starts to get moved to more out of the way places like the Bronx and Canarsie and Brooklyn.
Although not out of the way for people who live there.
yeah. But they no longer really have a retail component anymore because they're no longer within the communities, right?
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, here's a picture of the Moore Street Market. But yeah, let's shift gears and talk about some other cities and some examples of markets that we've had the opportunity to visit. The city that has the longest continuously operating public market system is actually Baltimore. You can see it on the sign right there of the world famous Lexington Market, as founded in 1782. The city of Baltimore operates 6 public markets. Many of them have recently gone through major renovations, including the Lexington Market. This building itself has actually been torn down, replaced by a new, I guess it's the east wing of the building. And, we visited in 2018 and there were a lot of empty stalls. And so it was definitely a building that was due for a refresher and reactivation. Obviously, the fear is that if you know anything about the geography of Baltimore, this is a very short walk from the Inner Harbor and from Camden Yards and the football stadium. But it feels like a world away. It's a very, very different landscape just in those few blocks. And I think many people look at the redevelopment of the Lexington Market as sort of a way to extend the intense gentrification of the Inner Harbor to this neighborhood as well. So, all of these redevelopments are going to be problematic, but yeah, it's definitely been an important anchor for the community for a long, long time. And there are other of these smaller versions of these markets as well. You find like in Fells Point and other neighborhoods that have recently been redeveloped. Most famous which is where we ate when we went here, was Fadley's, which is a famous seafood place. So we had some crabs there. We were in Maryland. We had to have them. But what's interesting is that a lot of those vendors are, they're in the market, but not necessarily of the market. Like that has an external entrance into it. So we saw so many people drive up, get out, pick up their food, go back to their car. So it was almost like a drive-through. So I think there can be that disconnect with the sort of overall goals and mission and landscape of the market. And when you have, certain vendors that are, popular or maybe catered to a different clientele than the rest of the market. Reading Terminal Market in Philadelphia, you can drop in the chat if you've been here, if you want to try the best pretzels in the world. Definitely a major tourist attraction for sure, and definitely a lot of great prepared foods and foods I wouldn't necessarily call staples you wouldn't want to eat every single day. But interestingly, it also, when we talk about that urban-rural connection, it's definitely a market that does that, right? Because so many of the vendors in here, come from the Amish country, just like many of the farmers markets in New York City are served by producers from Amish country. But definitely a really dynamic public space in Philadelphia. And one that, again, dates to this Matthew mentioned Carmen's cheesesteaks, of course. I was trying not to mention cheesesteaks in Philadelphia. It seemed a little, but yes, yeah, for sure.
I haven't tried them yet, so I will next time.
But yeah, a market that was built in the 1890s, as we were talking about. It's called the Reading Terminal Market after the Reading Railroad. So it was built on these rail connections. This is probably the public market we've been to the most and is one of our absolute favorites for a lot of reasons. But this is the West Side Market in Cleveland. A little bit later, it was built in 1912, and it's a gorgeous public building. We'll take a look on the inside. And part of the reason why we love it is because it has this beautiful Gustavino ceiling inside of it. But also, definitely from the experience that we've had in the market, definitely a really strong mix of both local shoppers and tourists.
Right? Yes, that's right.
And so there's lots of different specialty foods and desserts and things you can get there, but you can also, there's several, butcher shops. And it also has a farmer's market attached to it. It has an indoor year-round and then a summertime outdoor branch as well. And again, this was built as sort of a wholesale retail hub, to connect with the railroads and trucking. And now it's, and again, the West Side Market reflects Cleveland's strong Eastern European heritage. So yes, there's no shortage of pierogies and Polish sausage that you can get there. We actually had some fantastic Lebanese food.
Yes, we did.
When we were there last. So really, really fantastic public space. But again, Cleveland's West Side is a neighborhood that has changed very, very rapidly and is also, very rapidly gentrifying as well. So you sort of have a bar district that's grown up nearby. Another place to visit if you're ever in the neighborhood is the Great Lakes Brewing Company is right across the street from it. But definitely still reflects the heritage of the community for sure.
And you can see, with public markets, we can see the sign over to the left. There's a little bit of a reflection, but it's yellow with black writing and then black with yellow writing about EBT cards and accepting EBT cards. This is something we also see with most of the vendors at the Essex market. You really have to, if you have a public market, you say it's a public market, you have to create that affordability for customers. Maybe not every vendor is going to be able to sell at that price. If you have, I think that's sometimes a challenge, right? Bringing in small locally owned businesses that are making the food. Sometimes that food needs to be sold at a higher price in order for them just to stay in business, right? But at the same time, you want to make sure that there's that affordability for people that want to buy their groceries or buy something that's affordable to eat. And so that has to do with rents and sort of how you manage your market to make sure that there's actual public access.
Yeah, and that could be a criteria we could put in our definition, which is, do you accept EBT,
Yeah,
frankly?
yeah.
And actually, one thing we'll share, again, we'll put a lot of these resources onto the program page on our website. You can find it on our blog. But we'll share an article that was written by Lauren Margolis, who works at the Essex market, and the way that the market has responded to the pandemic. And they reported during the first year, I guess, of the pandemic, about a third of the sales in the Essex market were through SNAP, through EBT. So definitely, it's an important part of the role of markets, is providing affordable food. Another, you can kind of map like where we
Where
drive.
we travel.
So Cindy's from Michigan, I'm from Connecticut, and so we drive through Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan a lot. And so we stop at markets. So this is the Eastern market, again, in Detroit, built as a sort of wholesale retail market, dating back to the 1890s, 1891, I think it was when the first buildings were constructed. And it definitely has that feel. It has a lot of open air spaces, as well as some enclosed market spaces, like you can see here. You know, Eastern market is interesting. It's definitely driven. Oh, and Amy mentions back to the West Side Market. She says the prices are very fair and the Lebanese place is terrific, with at least 10 flavors of hummus. That's right. Yeah. That was amazing. But yeah, I mean, Eastern Market, definitely when you go there on a market day, it's definitely a very, very, active site, as you can see with all the people crammed in here. I mean, I think one of the criticisms of Eastern Market, which is owned by the city, it's run by a nonprofit organization, is that there are fewer and fewer of the, produce and kind of staples vendors, more and more specialty merchandise and specialty foods. And therefore it's serving the local community less and less. If you know about Detroit and you know the demographics of Detroit, this is not what Detroit looks like. And so it's a lot of people coming from the suburbs, which is great to draw people into the city and do business. But there's been a lot of criticism of Eastern Market in recent years that it's serving the local community less and less. And we'll share some more detailed reporting on that as well. But it does have this awesome series of murals. Yeah, I wanted to share this because there's this amazing, this is sort of the symbol of the market, and it's like this arcambolo image of a cow, made out of vegetables. It was painted in the 1960s or the 1970s, I believe. You can take tours of Eastern Market, actually.
Yeah.
So they offer guided walking tours, and they walk you through all the murals that are around the area. But it's very much a market district, in that, in addition to the sort of public buildings, there's also a lot of cash and carry businesses around there. So it is very much a food distribution hub around there. And we have fewer and fewer of those kinds of spaces around New York City. Obviously, Hunts Point, in addition to the public wholesale markets, there's lots of distribution centers and cash and carry places, but we have fewer and fewer of those merchandise districts like we used to have in Manhattan, or like, for example, the Brooklyn Meat Market, which used to be in Fort Greene, right next to where the Barclays Center is today, where you have this sort of mass of all these different small producers that were congregated together. You still see some of that around the Eastern Market in Detroit. But again, in the 30s and 40s, we started to build these larger, more remote wholesale distribution hubs to accommodate trucks. And we still, in addition to the Hunts Point Market, most people don't know that Brooklyn also has its own terminal market, which is in Canarsie, which was built to replace the Wallabout Market. And they've also started bringing in some retail. And we're seeing this in many places where these sort of desolate, far off trucking hubs they are in communities. There are people that live around there. And so having a retail component so people can come and purchase affordable food is important. So you can go and do some shopping at a handful of vendors in the Brooklyn Terminal Market.
And the thing is, they can make it affordable because it's
Yeah.
a wholesale market. So it's kind of awesome that they're doing that.
Yeah. There's a similar initiative in my hometown in New Haven. If you've ever driven on I-95, you've driven right past the New Haven food terminal in Long Wharf. I think this is a far off vision, but the idea is to turn it into a true public market. Right now, there are a couple dozen large scale distributors and some manufacturers in there as well. All the pizza boxes in New Haven are manufactured and printed in the food terminal. But we have a long time non-traditional tenant that's in the food terminal, which you can see on the left in this rendering, which is the Long Wharf Theater, which has been around since the 60s or the early 70s in that site. It's a very, very well-known, highly regarded theater. So maybe some of you have been to shows there, and you've been to a wholesale food market as a result. But I thought we talked about my hometown. Let's talk as our last example a little bit about Cindy's hometown, and this is the Flint Farmers Market, which is a great example of reactivating abandoned space, essentially. So this is inside the old printing plant of the Flint Journal. Is that right?
Yeah.
So it's a newspaper printing plant. Flint has had a public market in more sort of informal spaces and sheds and things like that, not a large building, since 1920. But in 1914, they moved that into this building right here. And it's not open every day, but it's open a few days a week. And in addition to prepared food vendors and specialty food vendors, there is produce. There are farmers who sell direct there, and then they also have food education.
Yeah.
As well,
And I think it's 2014, right? Not 1914.
Oh, sorry, 2014. sorry.
Yeah, this is a more recent. This
Yeah.
is like a younger indoor public market, but definitely reflects the spirit, I think, of Flint. And if you get the chance to go to Flint Farmers Market when you're in Michigan, definitely check it out.
Yeah. Again, I would say it has similar challenges as the other public markets that we have talked about, in that it does draw a lot of people from the suburbs.
Yes,
right?
That's fair.
It doesn't necessarily look like the community of Flint when you go inside. But yeah, I think that can be a role for public markets, is to draw people back into the central business district. It becomes problematic when it becomes an engine for displacement, right? But yeah, so we're just about out of time. If anybody has any other questions or comments that you'd like to add, again, we really just scratched the surface in terms, there's so many other great public markets we could have talked about, like in Washington, D.C. Obviously, Pike's Place Market in Seattle is one we didn't talk about, but we just want to give a few examples of places that we've traveled to recently and how they illustrate the different kind of modalities and uses of public markets, and also the challenges that they face. So we're going to share some of some links to these markets, so you can go and check out the vendors and maybe visit them the next time you're in those cities, but also some of the scholarship that's been done and the public policy, especially from the Project for Public Spaces, the work that they've done on the Market Cities initiative. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. And we just scratched the surface. There's so much. This is like an open question. I think it's evolving. We're trying to find a way. How do we continue to make public markets these reactive spaces to the surrounding communities, where they actually build community, existing communities? And I think that's not as strange as it might sound, we use tours at the public markets, where we lead tours to try to educate people, including tourists, about why we need public markets and how important they are to the local community and what purposes they serve. And so, we're looking forward to seeing more research and sharing more stories and learning together. And we hope you'll join us either on the public markets tours when we get them up and running, or on any of our other tours that we're currently operating.
Yeah.
So,
and I'll just add, Amy mentioned that Toronto has great markets, and Toronto is another one of the model market cities sites, with Pittsburgh and Seattle. So again, we'll share the work that's been done by Project for Public Spaces. But thank you all so much. We'll see you on our next program on Sunday, and have a great day.
Thank you.